I have lived through many things. I have seen the sun rise over the same hills my grandfather was born on. I have buried children in soil that once fed them. I have watched neighbors become enemies overnight, not because they chose it, but because something vast and unstoppable was moving across the land, and none of us were ready for what it would leave behind. The name for what happened to us is the Mfecane. In the Nguni languages of southern Africa, it means the crushing. The Lesotho people call it the Difaqane, the scattering, the forced wandering of a people with nowhere left to go. Both words are correct. Both words are insufficient. Because what happened in southern Africa in the early decades of the 19th century was not simply a war or a famine or a migration. It was all of those things at once. A catastrophe so complete, so total, that it rewrote the map of an entire continent. Millions of people died, millions more were displaced, forced from the lands their families had farmed for generations, driven into mountains, deserts, and forests, becoming refugees in their own continent. New kingdoms rose from the wreckage, old ones were extinguished forever. This is the story of the Mfecane, and I was there.
Let me tell you what the Mfecane was, because history has not always told this story honestly. It was a period of catastrophic, cascading conflict and forced migration that tore through southern and central Africa during the first half of the 19th century. It began in what is now the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa, in the fertile, contested lands between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean coast. And from there, it spread outward like a fire that has found the wind. It was not one war, it was not one battle. It was a chain reaction, each act of violence producing refugees, each group of refugees producing new conflict, each new conflict displacing more people, further and further from their homes, until the devastation had reached as far as modern-day Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Lesotho.
It was caused by many things at once. A severe drought that had been grinding through southern Africa since the 1790s, drying up rivers, killing crops, turning fertile grazing land to dust. Population growth that had put more people on less productive land than the earth could sustain. Competition over the remaining resources that had already set neighboring communities against each other long before the first great army marched. And then there was the presence of Europeans on the coast. First the Portuguese, hungry for ivory and commercial advantage. Then the British, who had settled at the Cape and were beginning to push their influence inland. Their arrival created new commercial opportunities for whichever African group could control the trade routes, and the competition for that control added fuel to a fire already burning. But make no mistake, this was not simply chaos. It was not savagery. It was not the inevitable consequence of African primitiveness, as European writers would later claim. It was a political and military revolution. Brutal, yes, devastating beyond measure, but driven by leaders of extraordinary intelligence and ambition, men and women who were navigating a world that was already falling apart around them. To understand what the Mfecane was, you must first understand the world it destroyed, and to understand that world, you must go back to the land and to the people who lived on it.
Before the storm, there was a world. In the lands between the Drakensberg and the sea, dozens of clans and chiefdoms shared the same general territory, not always peacefully, but according to rules that everyone understood. You raided your neighbor's cattle, they raided yours. Sometimes there was war, sometimes there was alliance, but the conflicts were bounded. They did not consume everything. Cattle was the language of this world. Your wealth was measured in cattle. Your bride price was paid in cattle. Your status in the community, your access to land, your political alliances, all of it flowed through the cattle kraal at the center of the village. When you sat down to resolve a dispute, you sat in the cattle kraal. When a chief held court, he held it among his cattle. They were not merely animals, they were the living embodiment of prosperity, ancestry, and power. The dominant political structure in this region was the Mfecane kingdom, a confederacy of clans and chiefdoms that had grown powerful by controlling trade with the Portuguese on the coast. Its king, Dingiswayo, was a shrewd and visionary leader who had expanded his realm not only through military force but through diplomacy, incorporating neighboring groups under his authority while leaving their local chiefs largely in place. It was Dingiswayo who first saw the potential of the young man who would one day remake the world. His name was Shaka. He was the son of Senzanga Kona, chief of the Zulu clan, one of many clans under the Mfecane Confederacy. Shaka had spent much of his childhood in exile, scorned as illegitimate, toughened by hardship into something extraordinary. When Dingiswayo recognized his military genius, he gave him command, and Shaka began to show the world what he was capable of. Then, in 1818, Dingiswayo was killed, captured and executed by a rival chief named Zwide. The Mfecane Confederacy fractured. The power vacuum was enormous, and into that vacuum, with devastating speed and clarity of purpose, stepped Shaka. The world that had existed before was about to end.
I have heard people debate Shaka Zulu for my entire life, whether he was a genius or a monster, whether the stories of his cruelty were true or whether they were exaggerated by European writers who needed Africa to be barbaric in order to justify what they were about to do to it. The truth, I believe, is more complicated and more human than either version. What I know is this: Shaka was a military revolutionary. In a region where warfare had followed the same patterns for generations, massed armies clashing at a distance with long throwing spears, each side absorbing casualties until one gave way, he changed everything. The weapon Shaka is credited with popularizing was the Ikloa, a short, broad-bladed stabbing spear designed not for throwing but for close combat. Where the long spear battle had been almost formal, two armies hurling weapons at each other from a safe distance, the Ikloa demanded something different. It demanded that you close the distance, that you get close enough to look your enemy in the eye, that you finish what you started. Paired with this weapon was a new battle formation, the classic bullhorn encirclement, izimpondo zenkomo. The chest of the bull would engage the enemy directly, pinning them in place. The two horns, fast-moving flanking regiments, would sweep around both sides, encircling the enemy before they could flee. It was not invented by Shaka. The principles had existed before him. But under his command, it was brought to a level of disciplined, devastating perfection that the region had never seen.
And those who fled, the survivors, the displaced communities who ran rather than fight, they became the Mfecane's most destructive force. Because they did not simply flee, they became raiders themselves. Desperate for food, for cattle, for survival, they fell upon whoever lay in their path, triggering new waves of displacement, new chains of violence, spreading the devastation far beyond the reach of Shaka's own armies. Then came the event that pushed everything over the edge. In 1828, Shaka's mother, Nandi, died. Nandi had been the one constant in Shaka's life, the woman who had protected him through his years of exile and humiliation, whose love he had returned with absolute, consuming devotion. Her death broke something in him. He declared a year of national mourning across the entire kingdom. No crops were to be planted, no cattle were to be milked,
No one was to eat meat. Sexual relations were forbidden. Every person in the kingdom was required to weep daily with genuine tears. Those who did not weep convincingly enough were killed. Over 3,000 women were executed, accused of having caused Nandi's death through witchcraft. Pregnant women were killed. Couples found together were killed. The famine that followed the planting ban caused suffering on a scale that his wars alone had not. By September of 1828, even his most loyal commanders had reached their limit. Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers Ndingane and Blangana with the help of a chief named Mbopa. He died in the same compound where his mother had once nursed him back from the edge. He was perhaps 40 years old. He had ruled for 10 years. In those 10 years, he had remade South Africa forever.
The scattering did not happen at once. It happened in waves, each one triggered by the last, each one carrying its own devastation further from the source. Some groups fled in the early years of Shaka's expansion, pushed ahead of his armies like water before a wave. Others left during the years of famine and mourning. Some did not move until long after Shaka himself was dead, the violence he had set in motion continuing without him, like a fire burning through dry grass. Let me tell you where they went. To the north and west moved the Ndebele, led by one of Shaka's own Indunas, a man named Mazilikazi. He had served Shaka faithfully, commanded his own regiment with distinction, and been trusted with power. But when he was ordered to surrender a portion of his cattle as tribute after a successful raid, he refused. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the first moment of clarity about what Shaka's kingdom truly cost those who served it. Whatever the reason, Mazilikazi fled in 1822, and the consequences of that decision would reshape two countries. He crossed the Drakensberg. He moved on to the Highveld, gathering other displaced groups as he went, building a new military state modeled on what he had learned under Shaka, the age regiments, the Indunas, the disciplined formations. For over a decade, his people, who came to be known as the Makabele or Ndebele, lived in the interior of what is now South Africa, fighting off attacks from the Zulu, from rival groups, and eventually from the Boers, who were also pushing inland. Relentlessly pressed from multiple directions, he finally led his people north across the Limpopo River into the plateau of what is now Zimbabwe, where they established the Matabele Kingdom, a state that would survive until the British arrived at the end of the century. To the northeast moved the Shangaan, a group led by a general named Soshangane. He had also served in the Zulu military world, and he took everything he had learned there with him. Moving into what is now Mozambique, he established the Gaza Kingdom, a powerful military state that would dominate the region for much of the 19th century, drawing tribute from the Portuguese settlements on the coast and building an empire that stretched across enormous swathes of southern Mozambique. To the north moved the Ngoni in two great streams. One, led by a chief named Zwangandaba, crossed the Limpopo River, moved through the Zimbabwean plateau, crossed the Zambezi River during a solar eclipse in 1835, a moment his people would remember and recount for generations, and finally settled in what is now southern Tanzania by the 1840s, where their descendants, known as the Ngoni, remain to this day. Another branch moved into what is now Zambia, where they conquered the Lozi people for a period before eventually being absorbed into the broader regional political landscape. To the west, groups of Soto-speaking peoples fled the destruction of the lowlands and moved into the mountains. Some were conquered by others passing through, some were absorbed, some simply died of hunger, exposure, or violence. The entire region between the Drakensberg and the Kalahari was turned inside out.
populations compressed into previously uninhabited areas, leaving vast stretches of the lowveld empty of the people who had called it home for centuries. It was the emptiness left behind that would make the Mfecane's legacy most catastrophic in the long run, because into that emptiness, looking for land and opportunity, came the Boers. The Dutch settlers at the Cape, squeezed out by British rule and hungry for land, began their great trek into the interior of southern Africa in the 1830s. They moved through landscapes that had recently been home to hundreds of thousands of people, landscapes now largely emptied by the Mfecane. They called it a wilderness, a place without history, a land given to them by Providence. It was nothing of the sort. It was a graveyard, and its emptiness was not natural. It was the wound left by one of the most devastating humanitarian catastrophes in African history.
Not everyone who faced the storm was destroyed by it. Some of the most extraordinary acts of political and military genius in African history were performed by men and women who looked at the Mfecane and chose not to run, or who ran and in running built something new. Let me tell you about Moshwesho. His name, Moshwesho, comes from the sound of shaving. It was a name he earned for his skill as a cattle raider in his youth, the swish of his blade as he expertly separated rival chiefs from their herds. It was a violent beginning for a man who would become the most skilled diplomat in 19th century Southern Africa. In the early 1820s, as Shaka's wars began pushing waves of displaced people across the Highveld, Moshwesho made a decision that saved his people. He moved them on the top of a mountain, Thaba Bosiu, meaning the mountain of the night, a high, flat-topped mountain with sheer cliff faces on every side, easily defended by a small force against a much larger one. He did not simply hide there. He built a kingdom there. As displaced and terrified people arrived on his borders, refugees from the Mfecane, fleeing Zulu raids, fleeing rival warlords, Moshwesho took them in. He offered protection. He asked for loyalty in return, but he was generous, not tyrannical. He understood something that many stronger-seeming leaders did not, that a king's power ultimately comes from his people, and a people beaten down by suffering will give everything to a leader who treats them with dignity. He also paid tribute to Shaka, sending furs and other goods south, buying peace with the most dangerous military force on the continent. He paid tribute to other powerful neighboring groups as well. He was not too proud to pay. He was too wise to fight wars he did not need to fight. In the 1830s, when Christian missionaries arrived, Moshwesho invited them into his kingdom, not out of faith, but out of strategy. The missionaries brought him access to European guns and horses. They brought him access to the political networks of the Cape. By the 1840s, the Kingdom of Lesotho, founded by a cattle raider on a mountaintop during one of the worst periods of violence Southern Africa had ever seen, was one of the most formidable and stable political entities in the region.
Then there was Mzilikazi, the man who had defied Shaka and paid for it with exile, who had spent 15 years crossing the entire breadth of Southern Africa with his people, fighting off attackers on every side, building and rebuilding his state as he went. Where another man might have been broken by 15 years of flight and warfare, Mzilikazi only hardened. He maintained the military structures he had learned under Shaka, the age regiments, the disciplined indunas, but he adapted them, added to them, made them his own. When he finally crossed the Limpopo River and settled on the Zimbabwean plateau in the late 1830s, he did not arrive as a refugee, he arrived as a conqueror. The Matabele kingdom he established in what is now Western Zimbabwe would survive until 1893, when the British South Africa Company finally brought it down. And Soshangani's Gaza kingdom in Mozambique which grew powerful enough to extract tribute from Portuguese colonial settlements on the coast, to absorb and reshape dozens of local communities, to maintain military dominance over a vast stretch of southeastern Africa for decades. These were not small achievements. These were nations, built from nothing in the middle of a catastrophe by people who refused to be erased. The Mfecane did not only destroy, in its terrible wake it also created, forging new identities, new states, new peoples who carry those origins with them into the present day. The Soto nation, the Ndebele of Zimbabwe, the Ngoni of Tanzania and Malawi, the Swazi kingdom, all of them born from the fire.
I said at the beginning that what happened to us was not simply a war or a famine or a migration. I said both words Mfecane, Difaqane were correct and insufficient. Let me tell you what was left when the storm had passed. Millions of people dead, from warfare, from famine, from displacement, from the slow violence of being pushed off your land into places where human beings cannot easily survive. Cannibalism, that most desperate of human acts, was documented in communities reduced to starvation in the aftermath of the conflict. People eating people because everything else was gone. Let that sit with you for a moment. Let it sit with you the way it should. Entire regions depopulated, stripped of the communities that had lived there for generations, leaving vacuums that other forces would rush to fill. The Boers who moved into the interior in the 1830s found land that appeared empty. It was not empty. It was a mass grave. And the political structures of colonialism that followed, the carving up of this land into Rhodesia, into British Natal, into the Boer republics, were built on top of the Mfecane's devastation as much as they were on their own violence. Traditional authority was shattered across enormous swathes of the region. Chiefs who had led their communities for generations were killed, scattered, or absorbed into larger entities. The political independence of dozens of peoples, the Hlubi, the Bele, the Zizi, the Mpondo, was compromised or extinguished entirely. Wandering groups of refugees with no land, no cattle, and no chief became servants and laborers for whoever would feed them, including eventually European settlers who were only too happy to find a ready supply of landless, desperate people.
But the Mfecane also produced the Soto nation, which survives today as the independent kingdom of Lesotho, one of the only African states to have negotiated its own survival through diplomacy, strategy, and one extraordinary man's refusal to be destroyed. It produced the Ndebele people of Zimbabwe, whose language, culture, and political traditions are a living inheritance of Mzilikazi's long march north. It produced the Ngoni of Tanzania and Malawi, who carried their military traditions and their identity across thousands of kilometers and kept them alive. It produced the Swazi kingdom, today's Eswatini, whose very identity was forged in the crucible of the Mfecane's violence. It produced new understandings of what it meant to be a people, new definitions of identity, loyalty, and belonging that were tested by the most extreme circumstances imaginable and found sufficient to survive them. I have lived through many things. I have watched the Mfecane scatter my people like seeds in a drought wind, some falling on stone, some falling on good soil, some carried so far they cannot find their way back to where they started. I have watched the empty lands we left behind be claimed by people who called themselves pioneers and called our absence wilderness. But I have also watched what survived. I have watched a cattle raider build a mountain kingdom that no army could break. I have watched an exiled Induna carry a nation on his back across half a continent and set it down intact on the other side. I have watched ordinary people, farmers, mothers, young men who never wanted to fight anyone, endure the unendurable and keep living,
keep planting, keep building. The Mfecane was the crushing and the scattering, but it was not the ending. The people of Southern Africa were scattered, but seeds that are scattered do not die. They find soil, they take root, they grow into things their scatterers never imagined. We are still here.
Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like, comment, and share to reach other African history lovers like you and me. Subscribe to Sahara Scrolls and turn on post notifications so you won't miss out on future videos because we drop weekly.